were a little bit difficult for us to comprehend. Now we come to chapter 11, and we get something that is somewhat not really understood in our culture because we don't really have such things. We do, but yet we don't. We don't really talk about it. It's certainly not formalized in ours. Other cultures all across the planet, especially if you think of Hinduism and things like that, they have these kind of things, but we're going to see that this is sanctified. This is a little bit different. So if I tell you these words, clean and unclean, it probably conjures up an image. Now, if you were in the caste system in Hinduism, you would think about those who were untouchable, those that for their entire life were born into a caste that was lower than lower class. They are the dogs of society, and you have the others that are in the higher case. But this is not what this is talking about. This is not clean and unclean, is not something that is a societal setting in Israel's society. Rather, clean and unclean designates whether you are ceremonially clean in order to enter into the holy presence of God. That is, are you clean? In other words, can you go into the tabernacle? Not into the tabernacle itself, but can you enter into its gates and into its courts? Can you go into sacrifice? Can you go into worship? You see, God is holy. He is holy, 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 the scripture says. The only attribute of God ever given that threefold repetition. If you want to think of God's attributes, then holiness is probably one of the top, or at least the all-encompassing one. God is holy. That is what defines God. He is separate from sin. He cannot be in the presence of sin. Therefore, sinful people cannot go into the tabernacle. And by the way, clean and unclean does not always designate someone as a sinner at that point. To be unclean does not necessarily mean that you sinned, although if you sinned, you are certainly unclean and unfit to go into the tabernacle until you go with the sacrifices that you have. Now, we get to this idea of clean and unclean, and I could give you a bunch of synonyms to try to round out the idea for you, but it's not really supposed to be something necessarily terrible about you, to be unclean. Now, it just means that for a time, until you become clean, you cannot enter into the gates of the tabernacle to worship God. So we come to chapter 11 in Leviticus, and you might see your title at the very beginning. It says, Laws About Animal Food. And this is probably one of the more famous or infamous parts of Leviticus or the Torah, because we know Jews have a dietary system, right? We know that they have a diet that they have to follow. We know it as kosher, although that word never occurs here. So they have to follow this strict diet. And so we're going to see some things are going to be clean to them, and some foods are going to be unclean to them. And all of this has to do with showing Israel, or demonstrating to them, and thereby teaching us as well, what it looks like that God is holy. And by the way, this also separates Israel from who? The nations. We've already seen that in Genesis. Remember when Joseph's brothers came to Joseph and they went to have a meal with him? They didn't know that he was yet their brother, so they didn't know he was an Israelite. But remember, Joseph sat at one table, they sat at another, and who else sat at another? The Egyptians, because there it says that Egyptians could not eat with the Israelites. They could not eat with people that tended sheep. It was abominable to them. It was detestable. It was loathsome to them. They couldn't bring themselves to eat at the same table. By the way, we think of going to a restaurant, sitting at the same table, the waiter comes, gives you your food. If you've ever been out of this country, you know that most places don't eat like that. They bring you one thing of this, one thing of the side, one thing of that, one thing of that, so that the entire table then dips in, usually with the hands, especially in the Middle East. They dip in and they eat. They put it on their plate or they eat. Now, that means that you're going to be very picky about who you eat with. If you're not going to sit down with sheep people, shepherds, who have been working with manure and gross stuff all day, touching sheep and dirt, and it's And so then they're going to come in and they'll probably wash, but can you imagine? They don't have the soap that we have today, so they're not getting their hands particularly clean, and they're just grabbing at the food, and you're having to dip in after them. That's quite an intimate experience. So to share a meal with someone, even in our day, is an intimate experience, but especially back then or outside of our American bubble, it's a very intimate thing that you want to do with people that you know that you can stomach, quite literally. And it complicates things when you have a diet and you eat certain things, and then someone else comes for you to share a meal with, and they can't eat what you eat. It's like having a vegetarian over for dinner, and you have this whole slew of meat on the table, and they can't eat it. I mean, that hinders the intimacy there, right? Because one group eats different foods than the others. Now, I think of the Indiana Jones movie whenever I think of this, but you go over to like India or something, and in the Indiana Jones movie, they have the soup with the eyeballs and the tentacles and things all sticking out. Or I went to Malaysia in 2011, and they would bring the chicken out, a whole chicken, and they would have the head stuck on there so that you know they're not cheating you. They just went out and killed the chicken, and they put the head on there so that you know that it's there, and that's kind of... Now, for somebody to have detestable food, things that you don't really eat and you can't stomach it, it's offensive to somebody. It's offensive to both parties. They're not eating your food, and they're placing food in front of you that you loathe and detest. It's a separation. And so the Israelites were separated by their diet. Now, along these lines, it's been asked why these foods, and we're going to go through this entire list here. Why are these foods clean and why are these foods unclean? There are a couple of explanations put forward. I don't know. We won't take too much time with this. First, it's said that the clean foods are put forward as being clean because they're the hygienic ones. Now, certainly the rules or the laws of being clean in Israel, secondarily at least, had some aspect of hygiene, but that is not the primary to it. It is not the primary. Best argument against that is then in the New Testament, why does Jesus all of a sudden say that all food is clean? He's all of a sudden telling you to go be as unhygienic as you want to be. That doesn't sound like something Jesus should do. Number two, it says that it's allegorical. And if you read the rabbis, this is really quite funny. They talk about, well, the rabbit or the things that chew on the cud. You're supposed to eat something that chews the cud because it's like chewing on the word. It's like meditating on the scriptures. And dividing the hooves, it's like dividing the word, cutting the word straight. Well, that's a little fanciful, not exegetically attainable. Now, there's another one that just says that God just told the Israelites this just because he's God. And in fact, we'll see that over and over, right? You shall do this because I am Yahweh, your God. You shall not do this. I am Yahweh, your God. You shall do this. You shall think this. You shall do, and so on and so forth. I am Yahweh, your God. And so that is definitely within the realm of the aspects of these things. In fact, I've already said we learn about uncleanness because this is how they come to view these animals, and they see that this is how God also views the people when they are unclean. They learn about clean and unclean from the animals that God has set aside as being clean and unclean. Now, fourth, we could say that it goes back to creation. And this has some merit with me. I think it's very interesting, but I don't think it's really tenable. I don't know if it's really defensible. It's certainly not exegetically provable. But it's an interesting theory that's been put forth in the last 50 or 60 years that says, well, based on the fact that it has the land animals, the sea animals, the air animals, the crawling creatures, just like Genesis 1 has. Remember, those are the groups of animals that God created in Genesis 1, because it talks about each of those groups individually and gives laws according to each one. It's going back very definitely to creation. And then they make arguments that this is going back to show you how creation was supposed to be, and you're only eating those things that go back to the old perfect creation. Again, I think that's a bit untenable, although it has some merit. And number five, it shows us it is because of worship. It is because the pagans, the Canaanites and the Egyptians and all, ate all or worshipped all of these animals. And so God is putting those out of bounds so that Israel will not eat them. Problem being that actually the animals that Israel was able to eat, think of the sacrificial animals, the bull and the sheep and the goats, those are all things that the Canaanites sacrificed. They were all things that the Canaanites ate. So it's not really something there that is worship. So you could say it's hygiene, you could say it's allegory, you could say it's just God's authority, you could say it goes back to creation, or you could say that it's because of the pagans' worship. The truth is, I think we can just all say all together, I don't know. It was all given by God in order to make the Israelites separate. And that's exactly what God's going to say at the end of the chapter. Whether God just kind of chose some animals and said, here, eat these, and chose some others and said, here, don't eat these, maybe. But I don't know if there's any other thing that we can really say about it, any other pattern that we can see in this text. Well, that was a big introduction. Let's get into that then. Verse 1, the Lord spoke again to Moses and Aaron. Just like we were talking about this morning, this is Revelation. God is revealing his word to his prophets, Moses and Aaron at this point, saying to them, now they're going to speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures which you may eat. From all the animals that are on the earth, whatever divides a hoof, thus making split hoofs, and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. Number 1, the camel. For, or because, though it chews the cud, it meets one of the qualifications, it does not divide the hoof. Has to be both qualifications in order to eat it. It is unclean, and circle this every time we come to it. It is unclean to who? You. This is to a specific people at a specific time. This is God speaking to them. It is unclean to you. It doesn't mean it's unclean to God, by the way. Number 2, likewise, the shafan. This is a rock badger, and it hangs out on the rocks all day and looks like it's chewing, but it's not actually chewing the cud. The shafan, for though it chews cud, or it appears to, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean, circle it, to you. The rabbit also, for though it chews cud, remember, rabbits always look like they're chewing if you look at them. It does not divide the hoof. It is unclean, circle it, to you. And the pig, for though it divides the hoof, thus making a split hoof, it does not chew cud. It is unclean to you. All of this is going to be rescinded later on for the church. This is to Israel at this time under the Old Covenant, not to the church. Now, you shall not eat of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses. They are unclean, again, to you. Now, this severely limits Israel on what they're able to eat. And when God does rescind this, then all of a sudden they are able to go out to all the Gentiles. They understood this as the clean representing Israel and the unclean representing the Gentiles. And so when all of that was rescinded and all foods were declared to be clean, then those borders were broken down, those barriers were extinguished, so that all of a sudden the gospel had no walls bouncing it back into Jerusalem, but went out into all the world so that all the Gentile peoples would hear it. That is how they understood this in Acts chapter 10. This is how Peter explained it in Acts 10 and 11. Now these, verse 9, you may eat. We switch from land creatures to water creatures. Whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales, those in the water, in the seas, or in the rivers, you may eat. In other words, if it looks like a fish, you can eat it. If it has fins and a scale like you expect a fish to have, you can eat it. This is where that one position comes to, that they'll say cleanness means actually wholeness, and I think there's some merit to that. So wholeness is looking back to creation. So whatever fits that idea of being a sea creature, which we think of water animals as having fins and scales and being fish, then that is what's clean. I'll leave that for you to think through. Verse 10, but whatever is in the seas and in the rivers that does not have fins and scales, among all the teeming life of the water, and among all the living creatures that are in the water, they are detestable things to you, circle that, and they shall be abhorrent to you. Now that's actually the same word. If you're following along in the King James or the New King James, I believe it's the same word, abhorrent and detestable. It's a very strong word. It's essentially an abomination to you. So this isn't just, you will not like these things. You will kind of sort of disagree with people eating this. This is, if somebody eats this, they are a terrible person kind of thing. They are not allowed in your fellowship. They are not to sit at your table kind of thing. And they shall be abhorrent to you. You may not eat of their flesh, and their carcasses you shall detest. So essentially, whenever something is dead, unless it has been sacrificially killed, it is not clean. It is unclean, and it makes the person who touches it unclean. Now, whatever is in the water and does not have fins and scales is abhorrent to you. We come to the birds. These, moreover, you shall detest among the birds. They are abhorrent, again, detest and abhorrent, the same thing, not to be eaten. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, the falcon in its kind, every raven in its kind, the ostrich, the owl, the seagull, the hawk in its kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. I would imagine that rules out quite a bit of the bird kind to be eaten. Now, a lot of these are carrion eaters. They are meat eaters that eat the dead. And so by virtue of coming into contact with dead animals already, those birds are dead and thereby not to be eaten. Now also come to inedible insects, or I guess these are edible insects. Verse 20, all the winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable, notice, to you. Yet these you may eat among all the winged insects which walk on all fours, those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat. The locust in its kind, the devastating locust in its kind, the cricket in its kind, the grasshopper in its kind, and you have to be pretty desperate to be eating these, but okay. But all other winged insects which are four-footed are detestable, notice again, to you. Now we get to carcasses of the insects. Verse 24, by these, moreover, you will be made unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean. Here's our first time interval. How long are they unclean for? Until evening. Why are they evening?
The sacrifice.
Because that is the beginning of the day when they first offer the sacrifice. Remember, Israel counts the day as being from evening to day, night to day. So a day actually starts around twilight. So their midnight happens right around twilight. So if you're going to become unclean, the time to become unclean would have been right before the sun was going down, because then you were unclean till evening, then you go about your way. Just a minute or two, a couple minutes here and there. You didn't want to become unclean at like 11 o'clock at night, because then you had to go the entire next day until the sun set again for you to become clean. That was the idea. Now, certain things that bring on worse uncleanness will require longer times to become clean. And whoever picks up any of their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Now we get to carcasses of land animals. Concerning all the animals which divide the hoof, but do not make a split hoof, or which do not chew cud, they are unclean to you. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. Not just carcasses there, but carcasses there. Whoever touches a carcass becomes unclean. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. Also, whoever walks on its paws. So sorry, all you dog lovers and you cat lovers. Whatever walks on its paws among all the creatures that walk on our fours are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening. And the one who picks up their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. By the way, just to wash your clothes was a little bit more of a chore than we think of it. Although some of you, I don't know, did any of you ever hand wash clothes? I certainly didn't. And so you know that that's more of a chore. They didn't have washing machines back then. A day that I can't imagine. They are unclean to you. Swarming creatures, carcasses next, verse 29. Now these are to you the unclean among the swarming things which swarm on the earth. The mole, the mouse, the great lizard and its kind, the gecko, the crocodile, the lizard, the sand reptile, the chameleon, and everybody here says amen. These are, notice, to you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead becomes unclean until evening. Also, anything on which one of them may fall when they are dead. So here we get into the practical idea, the practical parts of life. If a rat falls off dead as it's climbing on top of something and rolls over and falls into your pot, what do? How do you make that thing clean? And all of us are going, yeah, how? Also, anything on which one of them may fall, verse 32, when they are dead becomes unclean, including any wooden article or clothing or skin or a sack, any article which is made or of which use is made. It shall be put in the water and be unclean until the evening. So it's to be put in water, washed, cleansed, and it'll sit until evening like that. Then it becomes clean. So you're out that pot or that wooden spoon or whatever it is until evening. Then it is considered clean. As for any earthenware vessel into which one of them may fall, whatever is in it becomes unclean, and you shall break the vessel. So if it falls into a wooden vessel, whatever is in there, if you have food in there, that food is now unclean, you have to throw it out. And then also the vessel is to be smashed. It's not to be used anymore. Any of the food which may be eaten on which water comes shall be unclean, and any liquid which may be drunk in every vessel shall become unclean. Have to throw it out. Everything, moreover, on which part of their carcass may fall becomes unclean. An oven or a stove shall be smashed. They are unclean and shall continue to be unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern collecting water shall be clean. It's kind of hard to clean out an entire cistern of its water, very impractical, and you can't just go smashing cisterns because, number one, that's time consuming, and number two, it's very expensive. So it's actually clean ceremonially, though the one who touches the carcass, the one who has to go in and fish out the carcass, will be unclean until evening. Or it doesn't say, shall be unclean. If a part of their carcass falls on any seed for sowing, which is to be sown, and it hasn't been watered yet, it's just sitting there waiting, it is clean. Though if water has been put on the seed, and a part of their carcass falls on it, it is unclean to you. You have to get rid of it. Also, if one of the animals dies, which you have for food, the one who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. He too who eats some of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening, and the one who picks up its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Now every swarming thing that swarms on the earth is detestable, go amen, not to be eaten. Whatever crawls on its belly, and whatever walks on all fours, whatever has many feet, and in respect to every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, you shall not eat them, for they are detestable. Do not render yourselves detestable through any of the swarming things that swarm, and you shall not make yourselves unclean with them, so that you become clean. Here is the entire deal right here. Here's the point. For I am Yahweh your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. Now, if we put this on a spectrum, you would have detestable and unclean, then you would have clean, and then you would have holy. 3 categories: unclean, clean, holy. Now, the unclean can become clean, and the clean can become holy. To make it unclean, you have to go through the process of washing and all. To become clean, to become holy, it has to go through consecration. Therefore, it says, consecrate yourselves, that you will be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is the law regarding the animal, the bird, every living thing that moves in the waters, everything that swarms on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. And if you remember, several weeks back at this point, in Leviticus chapter 10, the last chapter that we looked at, you'll remember that Moses, in chapter 10, verse 10, said that Aaron, the high priest, and Aaron's sons, the priests, one of their jobs is to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. So these instructions here are for the priests. They are the ones to teach the people then. Remember, the priests were told not to get drunk, not to drink on the job, so that they'd be able to accurately give this teaching to the people, to distinguish between that which is holy, that which is profane, and to distinguish between that which is clean and that which is unclean. And not only that, but we're going to get into a couple chapters here this week and next week that are going to talk just to the priests. Because the people are going to come to the priests for the priest to examine, and it's up to the priest to distinguish accurately whether the person is unclean or clean, and this is a very, very, very sobering, no pun intended, job. It's a very sobering job, because you're telling people if they can enter in to worship the Lord or not. You're telling them if they are clean to come into the presence of God, or if they're unclean to go out into the people of Israel, and even sometimes outside the camp. This is a very important thing for them to know. Could they come in, and could they worship the Lord? Now, we get into something here in chapter 12. And I want to reemphasize that when we mean unclean, or when we say unclean, we do not always mean that it's sinful. It doesn't mean that someone sinned. Now, certainly when someone sins, it is unclean, and it renders the person unclean. But it's not always sin that leads to uncleanness, right? I mean, if you went out and you had to fish a coyote or something out of your cistern, you're touching the dead animal, it makes you unclean until evening. It's not a sin to have gone into the cistern to get the animal, put it over your neck or whatever you had to do with it, and take it out to be buried or burned or whatever you do with a dead animal. Obviously, I live in America, right? And so it's not a sin. It's not always sinful to be unclean. But notice here that uncleanness happens in some of the most everyday circumstances. You're just cooking along, and all of a sudden a bug falls on you, and you're rendered unclean. You walk outside, and an animal, you stumble onto a dead animal. Probably happened quite a bit out in the wilderness, and you're unclean all of a sudden. And so uncleanness happens time after time after time. And in fact, it had to have been almost impossible sometimes to go an entire day without becoming unclean. And you had to be very purposeful then when you were planning to go before the Lord and to worship him, not to render yourself unclean. And so you have these holy days and these festivals where you're going before the Lord and you're taking all these things into the tabernacle. And you have to make sure not to defile yourself, not to become unclean, so that you can go in and you can celebrate these things in the house of the Lord. Now, all that being said, Leviticus chapter 12, anything with the overtones of death has uncleanness to it, right? Whenever you touch a dead carcass, you're unclean. Anything that has discharges of blood or something like that, that looks like death, we could say it's not the idyllic pre-fall conditions. It's unclean. And so in chapter 12, we come to childbirth. And you ask, well, isn't childbirth supposed to be the most blessed thing that God has ever given to us? Well, one of the most blessed things. I mean, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 talk over and over and over about be fruitful and multiply. I mean, that's childbirth, right? But yet in chapter 12, it's going to tell us that the woman, after she gives birth to the child, is unclean. Is that a sinful thing? Certainly not. And is giving birth then unclean? Certainly not. But remember what happened in the fall. Childbirth has become difficult. And I think a lot of you can attest to that, right? And so with that then comes a lot of very difficult things, a lot of discharges that are unclean. So then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, again, direct revelation, speak to the sons of Israel, this is to the people, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. Not just until evening, but she shall be unclean now for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall become unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. The time is doubled for a female child. It's not told us, we're not told why. And I read pages upon pages upon pages upon pages of commentaries talking about the reason for this. And they all come after about 100 pages each to the conclusion, we don't know. And I go, well, then I don't know why I just read that past all that 100 pages. And she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. When the days of her purification are completed for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And notice this is for both a boy and a girl. This is not saying that having a girl is worse than having a boy, because the woman has the longer time of uncleanness, the longer time of impurity. Rather, it's saying that the boy and the girl are both equal. They're both equally great blessings because she's bringing the same sacrifice. She's not having to double the sacrifice for the girl. And so that's not the reason for the doubling. So she shall bring to the priest the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. And that atonement is for the flow of the blood, it's for the discharge, it's not really for the sin. And she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, whether male or female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. Now, we're going to see this with Mary and Joseph and Jesus. They could not afford to bring, a lamb, so they brought the 2 turtle doves, the lamb and the pigeon. So they brought the 2 turtle doves in order to sacrifice them, and the 2 pigeons. Now we get into some fun things here. Chapter 13, we're going to hurry through it, because this isn't necessarily something we need to take a lot of time in, but we need to understand. Now, we've come upon this unclean and clean thing, and we've understood up to this point, I hope. And here we come into skin diseases. Now, this is not that the person comes to the tabernacle and the priest looks at it and gives some professional diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis of the sort that we think of diagnosis today, where they treat it in order for it to get better. Rather, this is a diagnosis to know whether this person is clean or unclean. It is so that the priest will be able to distinguish whether this person is clean or whether this person is unclean, and it goes through a lot of things. Now, we all know, as fallen people who suffer the same curse that the Israelites suffered, we all know that that shows up in our bodies in various ways. And under the Old Covenant then, since they were quite literally entering into the presence of God to worship, they had to know whether God considered them to be clean or unclean. Now notice here, verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, and it's not going to say, speak to the sons of Israel here. This is just for the priests. This is so the priests will learn to distinguish between clean and unclean. And he tells them, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, he shall be brought to Aaron the priest and to one of the sons of the priests. Now, when it says leprosy here, it's not talking about leprosy as we understand it today. It's not talking about Hansen's disease. It's a broader word than that. Quite literally, we could just say if there's a mark. It's if there is something on the skin that's abnormal. And in fact, that's going to go also for clothes, and it's going to go for tents. If there's something on the surface or deeper that looks abnormal, we need to know what's happening here. And more or less, we need to know, is this clean or is it unclean? So the priest shall look at the mark on the skin of the body, And if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is an infection of leprosy. When the priest has looked at him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate him who has the infection for 7 days. The priest shall look at him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the infection has not changed, and the infection has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 more days. The priest shall look at him again on the 7th day, and if the infection has faded and the mark has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. This is a lot, right? And so they had to understand how to do all of these things. They had to understand when to isolate them. They had to understand when not to isolate them. They had to remember to go check on the guy after 7 days, or the guy had to come to them, I don't know. And so every 7th day, it seems, you had to go to make sure that this thing was not getting worse until you were declared by the priest to be clean or unclean. So sometimes the verdict could take some time, and you would be isolated until that time. But if the scab spreads further on the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again to the priest. The priest shall look, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. When the infection of leprosy is on a man, then he shall be brought to the priest. The priest shall then look, and if there is a white swelling in the skin, and it has turned the hair white, and there is quick raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. If the leprosy breaks out further on the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of him who has the infection, from his head even to his feet, as far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and behold, if the leprosy has covered all of his body, he shall pronounce him clean, who had the infection, and it has all turned white, and he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. The priest shall look at the raw flesh, and he shall pronounce him unclean. The raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh turns again and is changed to white, then he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall look at him, and behold, if the infection has turned to white, then the priest shall pronounce clean him who has the infection, he is clean. When the body who has a boil on its skin, and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there is a white swelling, or a reddish bright white spot, then it shall be shown to the priest, and the priest shall look, and behold, if it appears to be lower than the skin, and the hair on it has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the infection of leprosy. It is broken out in the boil. But if the priest looks at it, and behold, there are no white hairs in it, and it is not lower than the skin, and is faded, then the priest shall isolate for 7 days. And if it spreads further on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the bright white spot remains in its place and does not spread, it is only the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Now, I'm reading through this very quickly because I want you to feel the sense of overwhelming just confusion here. There's a lot. There's a lot here. And I'm not going to remember where I left off now. But there is a lot here. And so you see just how hard it was for a person in Israel to remain clean before God. Now, hold on to the thought, and let's see if we can get through the rest of the verses here. Where did I leave off? 24. Or if the body sustains in its skin a burn by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the priest shall look at it. And if the hair in the bright spot has turned white, and it appears to be deeper than the skin, it is leprosy. It has broken out in the burn. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infection of leprosy. But if the priest looks at it, and indeed there is no white hair in the bright spot, and it is no deeper than the skin, but is dim, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 days, and the priest shall look at him on the 7th day. If it spreads further in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infection of leprosy. But if the bright spot remains in its place and has not spread in the skin, but is dim, it is the swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is only the scar of the burn. Now, if a man or a woman has an infection on the head, on the beard, then the priest shall look at the infection. And if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and there's a thin yellowish hair in it, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scale. It is leprosy of the head or of the beard. But if the priest looks at the infection of the scale, and indeed it appears to be no deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the person with the scaly infection for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall look at the infection, and if the scale is not spread, and no yellowish hair has grown in it, and the appearance of the scale is no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the scale. The priest shall isolate the person with the scale 7 more days. Then on the seventh day, the priest shall look at the scale, and if the scale is not spread in the skin, and it appeared to be no deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scale spreads further in the skin after his cleansing, then the priest shall look at him, and if the scale is spread in the skin, the priest need not seek for the yellowish hair, he is unclean. If in his sight the scale has remained, however, and the black hair has grown in it, the scale is healed, he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, even bright white spots, then the priest shall look, and if the bright spots on the skin of their bodies are a faint white, it is eczema that is broken out on the skin, he is clean. Now if a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald, he is clean. I'm good. If his head becomes bald at the front and the sides, he is bald on the forehead, he is clean. Again, I'm good. But if on the bald head or the bald forehead there occurs a reddish-white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead, then the priest shall look at him, and if the swelling of the infection is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, like the appearance of leprosy in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. This just keeps going. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean, as his infection is on his head. Now, I don't know if that's ever really been done in the history of the church. I'm sure it has. How many times have we all read this? Probably a lot. Do we have this memorized? If I gave you a quiz right now, could you pass a quiz? I couldn't. But this is what the priest dealt with day in and day out. They had to examine the person. They had to know if they had to isolate the person for further inspection. Then they had to be with the person again 7 days later and inspect them again and know whether the thing was growing, spreading, or whatever. Then they had to isolate them again and see if it was still spreading or whatever. Then they could pronounce them clean or unclean depending on the spread of the thing. And so then afterwards, it was still possible that the priest was wrong. So if it was still spreading on the body, the person came back and said, hey, this is bad. Now, imagine this. Day after day after day after day of working with this. And it's just constantly, you're unclean, you're unclean, you're unclean, you're unclean, you're unclean. What are you starting to see? You're starting to see just how terrible the effects of the fall are. And what are those? They exclude you from the presence of God. And it's not only just things that you did. It's not just sin at this point. We're talking about things that happen to your body without you even wanting them to happen to your body. And so you're excluded because you're not whole, you're not clean. And so the priest had to tell people, you're unclean. You're unclean. You're unclean. In other words, you're not fit to be in here and worship. Come back when you are. Aren't we thankful for Christ? Amen. Who has cleansed us, who has made us clean? We don't have to deal with this day in and day out. Now, we just have, a little bit more. This deals with the person himself. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Isolated. Not just isolated from the tabernacle, not just from the worship of God, but also from the fellowship of the people. He's outside the camp. And remember, you want to be inside the camp because where's God? Inside the camp. Where's your family? Where's your livelihood? Inside the camp. We're seeing the effects of sin here. We're seeing just how deep sin reaches within us. And when a garment So it doesn't just reach our bodies, it reaches our clothes. It reaches all those things that are around us. So when a garment has a mark of leprosy in it, whether it's a wool garment, a linen garment, warp, woof, linen of the wool, whether in leather or in any article made of leather, if the mark is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the leather, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in any article of leather, it is a leprous mark and shall be shown to the priest. Then the priest shall look at the mark and shall quarantine the article with the mark for 7 days. He shall then look at the mark on the 7th day. If the mark has spread in the garment, whether in the warp or the woof or in the leather, whatever the purpose for which the leather is used, the mark is leprous malignancy. It is unclean. So he shall burn the garment, whether the warp or the woof, in the wool or in linen or in any article in which the mark occurs, for it is a leprous malignancy. It shall be burned in the fire. It has to be destroyed. You have to get rid of it. But if the priest shall look, and indeed the mark has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof or in the article of leather, then the priest shall order them to wash the thing in which the mark occurs, and he shall quarantine it for 7 more days. After the article with the mark has been washed, the priest shall again look, and if the mark has not changed its appearance, even though the mark has not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it in the fire, whether in eating away has produced bareness on the top or on the front of it. Okay. Then if the priest looks, and if the mark has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment or out the leather, whether from the warp or from the woof. And if it appears again in the garment, whether in the warp or in the woof or in any article of leather, it is an outbreak. The article with the mark shall be burned in the fire. The garment, whether the warp or the woof or any article of leather from which the mark has departed, when you washed it, it shall be washed a second time and will be clean. This is the law for the mark of leprosy and a garment of wool or linen, whether in the warp or the woof or in any article of leather, for pronouncing it clean or unclean. And everybody goes, amen. Now, let's bring this practically. We don't have a lot of time. In fact, I'm way over time, and I apologize for that. But obviously this is negated, or it's not part of the new covenant, because we're not unclean. We're clean. In fact, we're not clean. We're holy. We're the next level above that. We have been consecrated as priests unto God so that we can come even into the holy place, it says, so that we can come in before God. Now, we still sin, we still stumble and fall, and John says then that God is faithful and just to cleanse us from our sin and to forgive us. Now, all of this becomes very practical later, when in the new heavens and the new earth, and by the way, remember what the tabernacle is a picture of? It is a picture of the new heavens and the new earth. It is God's kingdom upon earth. It is where God's presence is, dwelling among his people. At that point, it's God dwelling among a sinful people. But in the future, in the new heavens and the new earth, when Jerusalem is the temple, or when the whole earth is the temple, and when Jerusalem is the tabernacle, then it talks about the nations will walk by its light, that is the glory of God, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime there will be no night there, its gates will never be closed, that's the holy city, New Jerusalem, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. And nothing, guess what? Nothing unclean. Makes more sense now, right? Gives you a whole background now for that word unclean, because we said it about 1,000 times tonight. Nothing, get that. Practically everything in the world is unclean. In fact, there's a passage in James that talks about not being stained with the world. We don't understand just how often we're stained. We don't understand just how often that uncleanness reaches us. Even though we're not affected by it so much, it's around us. And so nothing, absolutely nothing that enters into it will be unclean. And no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only, exclusively, those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. It will be a city where only the clean are inside of it. And those clean are who? Those who are saved, those who are written in the book of the Lamb. And so even now, we have been washed by the blood of the Lamb. We have been cleansed from all impurity, so that we stand now, even now, And we will then, certainly in the presence of God, stand holy, blameless, above reproach. And we have been cleansed, we have been sanctified, and we have been now consecrated as priests of God, as Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2. We are holy as God is holy. That is how we are then to walk. And that's Peter's entire point there. You are priests of the living God. You are holy. Therefore, you shall be holy as God is holy. Seems like we encountered that in Leviticus chapter 11, didn't we? You shall be holy. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, for you shall be holy, for I am Yahweh your God, and I am holy. And that's where Peter quotes from. Practical, also very instructive, clean and unclean. And we have 2 more chapters of it next week. And then we'll see the entire point of all this in chapters 16 and 17. It comes to a climax even. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for these chapters which are very instructive to us, which contain a lot of things that are in many ways foreign to us because we're not part of the Old Covenant, and to be frank, we don't really read through and meditate on these quite as much as we should. I think we all would accede to that. But Lord, thank you for your grace. Thank you that we are pure before you, that we have been cleansed by the blood of the Savior, that you have washed our sins away, which had left us red as scarlet, but now we are white as wool. Thank you for our Savior who has done all of this. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, and very quickly we'll do our benediction. I apologize for going so late, but isn't this just interesting? Isn't this just great?